So let me ask you about the project, first of all. It's not just a standalone of George Washington, but that's the one that's produced now. Could you just tell us a little bit about this project?
Yes, sure. I have, by the grace of God, been able to make, and it's not finished, a 7-part series of films, about an hour each. And the purpose of it is to show the foundation of American liberty. And if anybody asks me, well, what's the foundation of American liberty? It's our Judeo-Christian heritage. It's that the founders recognize our rights come from the Creator, and God-given rights are non-negotiable. And the founders recognize that. They may have gotten some other things wrong, but they set the framework by which those things could one day be rectified, and many of them have been. In the meantime, though, they got this one key point: our rights come from God, and therefore the government is not to take them away. And so this is one part of the whole 7-part series. This is the only episode that's actually dedicated fully to one person, but George Washington is such a towering figure in American history. So we wanted to look at his life and also look at the faith part of his life. I mean, his life itself is extraordinary, and his accomplishments and his achievements for America. But he gave God a lot more credit than modern historians are willing to say that George Washington gave God the credit for. So part of our point was to basically tell the truth, tell the story, tell the full picture of George Washington's life and legacy.
Well, let me ask you about that spiritual component. Certainly we know there's no disguising that George Washington was, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen, but he had this faith component, and I've heard some secular historians put that down a little bit. Oh, he didn't, he wasn't praying by his horse all night. Can you just tell us about his beliefs and his faith journey?
Sure. Well, I had the privilege to co-write a book with Dr. Peter Loback. And that book is called George Washington's Sacred Fire. And it's a 1,400-page book. And the main point of it is that George Washington was an 18th century Anglican, committed Anglican, and all that entails. He was a regular reader of the Bible, as well as a regular reader of the Book of Common Prayer, 1662 version. In fact, he even had a copy of the Book of Common Prayer put down in a reduced form so he could keep it in his pocket. So he had it with him when he was on the battlefield and in camp and so forth. And he was very committed in this way. And he said over and over and over that God has helped us. More than 100 times, George Washington refers to God in positive ways, not in blasphemy ways. And by the way, when the Declaration of Independence first came and it finally reached him in camp, in July 9th of 1776, George Washington had it read to the troops, and he said there's a few rules now that the general, that's speaking of himself in the third person, are going to make. No blasphemy allowed in the army. And he said, you will go to church if you can, unless, there's a battle or something like that. You can't, Providence or whatever would prohibit you from going to church. No cursing, as I say, no gambling. It was as if he felt, and he even said this, that we can't win this thing if we don't have God's help. And so it would be a terrible thing to defy the very laws that heaven itself has ordained to us and revealed to us, to defy those laws and then expect God to help us. It's sort of like modern America. Modern America has forgotten God. We want God to bless America, but we're, living in ways against his will and so forth. We need that great revival you keep referring to, and that's a really great point. And so anyway, George Washington recognized the importance of following Christ. He even said, for example, in a very famous letter, it's called the Circular to the States, June 1783. He said, I now make it my earnest prayer, and he goes into this lengthy prayer, and the gist of it is, at the very end, he says, unless we imitate the divine author of our blessed religion, we can never hope to be a happy nation. In other words, unless we imitate Jesus as a nation, we can never hope to be happy.
Jerry and I just really love learning about George Washington and his deep-rooted faith, because I remember growing up and hearing about him, but I didn't learn about all these different things. And I'm just curious, can you tell us just a story of just how George Washington really saw God's divine providence, his protection, in a miraculous way that many of us don't even know about when it comes to our American history?
Sure. Well, I'll take you back to Pennsylvania, if you will, since you're in Pennsylvania, actually very close to where you are. There's a river, Monongahela, and it's just outside of Pittsburgh, around where Fort Duquesne used to be. And anyway, bottom line is, in 1755, when the British joined forces with the Americans, or the Americans joined forces with the British, this is, of course, before independence, 1755. And in July 1755, as the British were fighting, British Americans and some Indians were fighting against the French and other Indians. This was the French and Indian War. There was a horrible massacre right by the Monongahela River. And all the officers on the American and British side, or I should say the British and the American side, were killed, except for George Washington. In fact, some of the Indian leaders even said, "See that tall guy in the horse, talking about George Washington, kill him, shoot him." And they aimed their rifles at him. And for whatever reason, they didn't work. And then he said to his men, "Stop. The Great Spirit must have some purpose in mind for this young man." And George Washington was only about 23 years old. That night, after the general who wouldn't listen to him, the British general, General Braddock, Washington was more savvy than he was in terms of dealing with this kind of, guerrilla warfare, if you will. Anyway, bottom line is George Washington led the prayer service that night, since there were no chaplains available, and he, read the Book of Common Prayer book, funeral service. Which begins, "I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me should live even though he dies." If you go to Mount Vernon today, you can see that verse from John chapter 11, actually chiseled in stone right behind the two coffins of George and Martha Washington, right there on Mount Vernon. But that story is one example. He had 4 bullet holes in his cloak. He had a couple of horses shot underneath him and killed. But as I say, he was the only officer out of a few hundred on the American and British side that survived that massacre.
Yeah, Jerry, I've heard, I remember Dr. Kennedy, D. James Kennedy, talking about that. So it just sends chills up your spine to think of God's protection on him. So, Jerry, I've got a couple questions. I'll put them both into one and let you address them. One is the fact that the one is that he was willing to give up power after his 2 terms. He could have just been president for life, forever. He could have been a dictator. It could have been anything he wanted, but he willingly gave up power. That's one thing I want you to speak to. But the other thing is, and something we wrestle with in our modern society, George Washington owned slaves. What are we supposed to do with that, as understanding the evil of slavery and how it repulses us, but how are we to deal with that?
Okay, several things I want to mention. First of all, you mentioned Dr. Kennedy. D. James Kennedy Ministries is the overall umbrella of the Providence Forum, which, again, Dr. Lilback founded. And we're so grateful. I had the privilege to write books with Dr. Kennedy. But as far as the slavery issue, it's a very important issue. And Peter Lilback points out that George Washington was a 4th-generation landowner in Virginia gentleman farmer, and slavery was part of the deal. By the time he died, George Washington broke the cycle. George Washington freed his slaves on principle, and he made provision for them. And so it's like, if you followed the arc of his life, he was born into a society like that. And one thing I want to say about George Washington, as he was judged by his contemporaries, even in Great Britain, George Washington was such a remarkable figure and so respected that William Wilberforce, the member of Parliament, longtime member of Parliament, who fought almost single-handedly against slavery, and he won, but it was a 50-year Christian anti-slavery crusade. Part 1, stop the slave trade. Part 2, free the slaves in the British Empire. William Wilberforce was called in his day the George Washington of the world. Now think about that. If George Washington was not respected in his day, why would the abolitionist of all abolitionists be called in such a way that it referred to George Washington? So basically, it's not fair to judge historical figures based on the norms of that particular day, especially in the example of George Washington, where he broke the cycle. I think that's very important. As Bob Woodson of the Woodson Center, I've interviewed a few times, and he's an African-American leader in the civil rights movement. Back in the 60s he was, and he's still around today. But he says these historical revisionists are judging America by the worst of what we used to be, and that's not helpful. The important point is that we address these issues and then we move on in a positive direction. So I think that's important. You even saw the lady, Joyce Burgess, from she and her husband co-founded the National Black Homeschool League. And she said, that's in the past. We've got to move on and learn from it and make sure we don't make those mistakes again. How will future generations judge us when we have 4D sonograms and we have widespread abortion? We're all products of our time. And George Washington was a great man. Even to this day, he was.